Welcome back, everybody. Good to see you all again. We are making our way through the book of Esther, and I hope you've enjoyed the first two episodes. And if you haven't watched the first two episodes, please go back and watch them because you're sort of starting in the middle of the story now. Well, actually, we're near the beginning still, but we're moving ahead. The stage has been set, and we are now the plot and the storyline starts to gather momentum from this point onwards. So we're going to jump straight in. And we are going to have a look at Esther chapter 3. Now, just bearing in mind that the reason God told me to do Esther this month is because of Purim, and because this is the month that the Jewish people celebrate the Feast of Esther. And it's just an important time to be reminded that that is not just for the Jewish people. There is a story in the story. There is a message here for us. There is a prophetic message for the church herself. And we just need to be able to see past the Sunday school tale to the revelation of the story itself. Okay, so now, remember last time I said the stage has been set. You have King Xerxes, you have Esther, you have Mordecai, and they are all now, Esther's highly favored, Mordecai saved the king from death, here's the king. You would think that everything would go well. But here we go, chapter 3. So the very first verse of chapter 3, it says, after these things, King Ahasuerus, or Xerxes, promoted Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, and advanced him and set his seat above all the princes who were with him. So now enter stage left, Haman. And he then gets set above all the king's other princes. He's given this high authority. But who is he? That is the interesting point. Now, I want to say that not in all my research and everything that I've read up on this, not everybody agrees with this. So this is, but I'll tell you why I think it's the truth. But anyway, if you go back to 1 Samuel 15, when Saul had been appointed king of Israel, okay? And Samuel says to Saul that God has sent Samuel to anoint Saul as king over Israel, and he needs to listen and heed the words of the Lord. And then the Lord of hosts says, I have considered and will punish what Amalek did to Israel, and how he set himself, Amalek, how he set himself against him in the way when Israel came out of Egypt. So now God tells Saul to go and smite Amalek and all the Amalekites and to wipe them out completely. Women, children, animals, and they're not allowed to take any spoil from them. They have to destroy the whole entire lot of them, and they're not allowed to take any spoil or any plunder from them. Now, the king of the Amalekites, his name was Agag, and Haman was an Agagite. So some historians, Jewish historians and just historians, believe that Haman was descended from the Amalekites, and then they were changed to the Agagites because of King Agag. But now Saul was supposed to slaughter all of them, but he didn't. He actually left the king alive, and they took sheep and cows and all sorts of things. And so Samuel comes there, and Samuel says, like, I can hear sheep, I can hear cows, like, what are these noises I'm hearing? And Saul's like, oh yeah, well, and we kept some of it. And then he's like, well, and the king? And no, the king's still there. And the king's all quite like jaunty and chirpy, and, and says something like, surely the bitterness of death is past. I mean, this is King Agag. And Agag came to him cheerfully and said, surely the bitterness of death is past. And Samuel actually had to kill the king himself because Saul hadn't done what he was supposed to do. And that's the famous thing where Samuel says to obey is better than sacrifice. So Saul's like, okay, we kept a whole lot of the animals, but you know what? We're going to offer them as a burnt offering. And Samuel's like, that's not enough. You should have obeyed. Obedience is better than sacrifice. So he's not saying don't sacrifice, but he's saying that God asked you to do something. You didn't do it. You can't now go sacrifice and make it all okay. But a lot of historians and people who know about these sorts of things believe that Haman was descended from Agag, King Agag. That's because the story says that Saul kept some of the booty and kept some of the spoil, and he didn't kill the king, that there were probably other people, other Amalekites who actually escaped, and that possibly they called themselves something slightly different so that, they weren't known as Amalekites. And so because of that, Haman had been raised as an Agagite to oppose the Jews. He'd been raised with a hatred for the Jewish people because they had basically wiped out pretty much his whole entire nation. So, and this was all, because of what they'd done to the Israelites and all of that kind of thing. So, the Old Testament could be bloodthirsty in parts, but God had a reason for all of these things. But so this is where it gets interesting, because now we have Haman entering the story, but he has this history of hatred for the Jewish people. Now, you'll see later in the story why I believe that this is true, that he was descended from King Agag, from the Amalekites. So the king says that everyone has to bow down to Haman, because he's given him such huge authority that everyone has to bow down to him. Everyone has to reverence him. But Mordecai only bows to God, only reverences God. So Mordecai refuses to bow down to Haman. And obviously, Haman asks a few questions, and, a few things are said, and he discovers that Mordecai is actually a Jew, which I don't think Mordecai ever hid, but it was obvious when he must have asked why Mordecai wouldn't bow down to him, and Mordecai he's Jewish, so he will only bow down to the God of Israel. So he was very angry, Haman, and in a typical episode of the devil overplaying his hand, he could have just taken Mordecai out. He could have, and that would have been the end of that story. But he didn't. It says here in verse 6, he scorned laying hands only on Mordecai. So since they had told him Mordecai's nationality, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus or Xerxes. So remember, I think I've done an episode before on the devil overplaying his hand, or was in one of the prophetic words I gave. This is what he does. Haman could have just killed Mordecai. That would have been, but no, he now wants to kill all. So now it's the enemy. Okay, now hang on. We can ramp this up and make it a whole lot bigger and wipe the Israelites out again, as he's tried so many times over in history. And so this is what he decides to do. So then it says, in the first month, the month of Nisan. So the first month of the biblical calendar, the month of Nisan, Haman sits and casts lots to decide on a lucky day for when he will avenge himself on the Jewish people. And he casts lots, and I'm not sure how that all works, until eventually the lucky day is going to happen on the 12th of the month of Adar, which is a whole year later, because Nisan is the first month of the year of the biblical calendar, and Adar is the 12th month of the biblical calendar. So he was waiting quite a while for this vengeance. But it's just interesting to note that, because if you look at the month of Nisan, which is here somewhere. Oh, okay, I've lost it. I had it a moment ago. Here we go, Nisan. So that's the first month of the biblical calendar. It is the month of Judah. It is the month of praise. It is the month of the roar of the Lion of Judah. It is the month of the Lion and the Lamb. It is the month of Passover. So this is the month where the Jews celebrate Passover, where they celebrate the fact that God rescued them from the Egyptians. And in this very month that they celebrate the fact that God rescued them from the Egyptians, they have now another threat about to overtake them, and they don't know anything about it yet. And it's the month of Nisan is a month of restoration and awakening. And I wonder if sometimes all these things that overtake the Jewish people was to awaken them. Possibly, they lived in exile. You get used to it. Human nature is nothing if not adaptable. You adapt to your circumstances, you adapt to the way things are. And so I think sometimes, even as believers, as Christians, as a church, we're actually in exile. But we've gotten so comfortable there. that we live our lives quite happily there in exile. But we forget that there's a promised land that we're supposed to be getting back to. Because bearing in mind, the Jewish people, they could have chosen to go back to the promised land. Some of them couldn't. They couldn't afford it, whatever the case may be. But some of them could have and didn't because they were quite comfortable where they were. And I think that sometimes it's like God's like, you need to be shook up a little bit. You know, you celebrate Passover, but you've actually forgotten how I rescued you from the Egyptians. Because what have you done? You're now back in captivity, basically, in a different, under a different king in a different nation, but getting comfortable again in exile, miles away from the promised land. So Nisan is restoration and awakening. And I don't think there's any coincidence that that is the month that Haman started plotting his plan. And then the month of Adar is the month where it was going to happen, where he was going to make sure that all the Jews were executed. And that is a month, Adar is the month of joy and strength. I mean, it is the month of all things lovely. It is the month of celebration that your curse is overturned. And there was more than one curse over the Jewish people that God overturned. So it's the month, Adar is the month that they celebrate the Feast of Esther and they celebrate Purim because that's when it happened. But it is the month where your curse is overturned. So it's just very interesting. Anyway, but there was 12 whole months later that it was going to happen. So then Haman goes to King Ahasuerus and he says now listen to this. Okay. So these are Jewish people living in exile. Okay. They're in another nation. It says, there is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from every other people. Neither do they keep the king's laws. Therefore, it is not for the king's profit to tolerate them. So the Jewish people had somehow managed to live in the world, but not be of the world. They had somehow managed to live in Persia, in exile, and yet to still maintain the things that God had taught them. So they still were obeying their laws, and it couldn't have been because it seems like Haman was the first person to really bring it up. So it obviously hadn't bothered anybody up until now. And I think, isn't that just what the church is supposed to be? You know, in the world, but not of the world, you know, that if somebody looks, they can actually see that we're different, that we're not the same. Anyway, and then Haman goes on and he's like, if it pleases the king, you know, let me destroy all of them, just like that, and I'll give you 10,000 talents of silver, and it will go into the king's treasuries. And there are some historical stories about how, because King Xerxes really liked to war, and how his treasuries had been a bit diminished by all the war he'd engaged in, and so this was quite attractive to him that Haman was going to give this money and all of that because then he could rebuild his treasuries a little bit. It doesn't say that in the Bible, but it says that in some other historic accounts. So I mean, the king, he doesn't ask any questions. He doesn't, nothing. He's just like, oh, okay, go out and just wipe out a whole lot of people. You know, he doesn't even check to see what's going on. So, you know, the secretaries are called. It's all written up in legalese. And letters are sent by special messenger to all the king's provinces to destroy, to slay, and to do away with all Jews, both young and old, little children and women, in one day. So they're given one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, and they're allowed to slaughter all the Jews and seize their belongings. And apparently that's why 13 is considered to be an unlucky number. It comes from there. And it says here, the special messengers went out in haste by order of the king, or they had a whole year. And the decree was given out in Shushan, the capital, and the king and Haman sat down to drink. He drank far too much, this king. But the city of Shushan was perplexed at the strange and alarming decree. So it's like, even though the king was a bit of a wild card and he drank too much and he had this bad temper and threw his toys and made stupid decrees, people were still perplexed. It was still like a weird thing. They still couldn't understand it. They couldn't grasp. It was still a strange and alarming decree. It wasn't something that had ever happened before. Otherwise, they wouldn't have found it strange and alarming. So everyone, not just the Jewish people, everyone was kind of like not understanding what was going on, which also goes to show that the people lived alongside the Jewish people quite peacefully. And, and they didn't seem to be too perturbed about who obeyed what laws. And then you've got to wonder, what did they do? Did a whole lot of Jewish people get up and leave? Did some of them go back to Jerusalem, try and go back to Jerusalem to escape this? Because they had quite a long time. They had a good, sort of 11 months to prepare for it. It was there was plenty of time. I wonder if some of them left. I wonder, what they did. I wonder. Anyway, but the people who they talk about in the Bible was Mordecai. So Mordecai rent his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, went out into the middle of the city and cried with a loud and bitter cry. So he didn't take this lying down. They weren't quiet about this. He stood before the king's gate, and no one was allowed to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. So he stood before the king's gate in sackcloth and ashes, crying out with a loud cry about what had happened, about what had been decreed. And in every province there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. So it wasn't like they pretended they hadn't heard, or they sat and hoped that it would all be okay. They made a production out of it. They were like, oh no, this is terrible. It was terrible, but they didn't just keep quiet. They really let people know how they felt about it, and obviously sackcloth, ashes, fasting, weeping, and wailing. The first thing they all did in our eyes, what does that look like to you? Repentance. They fell down before the Lord, sackcloth, ashes, weeping, wailing, fasting. Save us, whatever we need to do. They must have been repenting. They must have been grieving. They must have been travailing. They must have been doing all of those sorts of things so that God would move in these circumstances. So Esther finds out, so Esther doesn't know about the decree, but she knows that Mordecai is going through something. So she sends someone to say to him, put your clothes on, and he's like, no. And he then sends a copy of the decree to Esther via the servant to explain to her what has been decreed, and to say to her to go to the king, make supplication to him, and plead with him for the lives of her people. And Esther comes back and says, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that any person, be it man or woman, who shall go into the inner court to the king without being called shall be put to death. There is but one law for him, except him to whom the king shall hold out the golden scepter, that he may live. But I have not been called to come to the king for these 30 days. So some people say that it seemed like she'd possibly fallen a little bit out of favor with the king. He'd probably found a concubine who was younger, or, something else. He'd got a bit bored, or he was too busy planning wars and things like that. So because she hadn't seen him for a month. And even as the queen, if she went into his presence without his permission, anyone who did that then was put to death. And the only way you could be saved is if you did it and the king held out his golden scepter to you. And if you've learned anything about the character of King Xerxes, King Ahasuerus, over this, you can't guarantee how he'll react. He's just this all over the place, very volatile kind of guy. He happily signed a death warrant for thousands and thousands of people. He just seemed to, So she couldn't even say, well, but he might react like this. She actually didn't know. And then now I want you to think of it like this as well. Remember that Mordecai raised Esther. Esther was an orphan. He raised her like his daughter. He loved her. He must have been once he'd got over the shock probably of her being forced into the harem and all of that, once she was chosen as king, he must have been proud of that. He must have known, because he was definitely prophetic, that there was a reason she'd been placed there. But at the same time, if you think as a mom, as anyone with your loved ones, you ask, how often is our first instinct to protect them? I try and put myself in that situation, and I think, would the first thing I've said to my daughter be, don't breathe a word about being Jewish. Just keep it quiet. And think to myself, well, if she's at least spared, like there'll be some sort of remnant left, would that, or would we say what Mordecai said to Esther? Mordecai told them to return this answer to Esther. Do not flatter yourself that you shall escape in the king's palace any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance shall arise for the Jews from elsewhere, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows but that you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this and for this very occasion? Prophet? I think so. He just prophesied. He prophesied to her that if she didn't do what she was supposed to do, relief would come elsewhere. So he never doubted that God would save the Jewish people. That's quite clear. Deliverance shall arise for the Jews from elsewhere, but you and your father's house shall perish. So he's saying God will deliver us one way or the other. But if you don't stand up and be counted now, you and your father's house will perish. This is his daughter, the woman he's raised as his daughter. The woman he walked past the harem every day to make sure she was okay. You've got to see that relationship there and understand what it must have cost him to say those words and to not automatically protect her, but at the same time, how he prophesied what would happen and how he knew he had absolute faith that God would deliver the Jews some other way then. But that Esther was born for such a time as this. And she then replies, Go gather together all the Jews that are present in Shushan, fast for me, neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. I also and my maids will fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. Now just remember, this is the month, the time when the Jewish people are celebrating Passover. They are celebrating God saving them before. So it's like God is history repeating itself. It's just a different set of circumstances. But I wonder if Mordecai if that wasn't what persuaded him, that God would deliver them. Because he's like, we are celebrating the fact that God brought our people out of Egypt, delivered them from Pharaoh supernaturally. So he's going to do this, whether it's through Esther or through somebody else. And she just says, okay, I hear you. So fast 3 days, night and day, no food, no water, and I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. So she reached the point, she moved from, you don't understand, I can't just go before the king. If I just go before the king, he can just kill me. It's like that with everybody. I haven't seen him for a month. I don't even know if he loves me anymore. I'm not sure if I've fallen out of favor. To, fine, I will do this, and if I perish, I perish. And I've said this before, and I'm going to say it again for all of you women watching this, and the men, because there are actually quite loads of men who watch as well. There comes a time in every believer's life where you have to stand up and be counted. And it might not be, at the end of a sword. It might not be that the fate of a whole entire nation hangs in your, rests in your hands or hangs in the balance. It might not necessarily be a life or death situation, although there are many, 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 many believers all around the world who deal with that on a daily basis. But there is going to come a time, and as we get closer to the end of all things, those times are going to come even more frequently, even more powerfully in every believer's life, where you have to stand up for what you believe. And when that happens, you need to know what you believe. So Mordecai just reminded Esther who her people were, who she was actually saving, and he spoke her destiny over her. He said, for who knows but that you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this, and for this very occasion. He said to her, Esther, you can't be scared now. This is your destiny. He prophesied that. And I just prophesy that over you right now, that the very situations where fear is holding you back, where you are too scared to step out or too scared to step forward, that is where your destiny is, that your destiny lies on the other side of that fear. And if you can just get past that, if you can just say, Lord, you know what, no matter what, even if I perish, I perish. I'm going to take my stand. I'm going to banish fear, and I'm going to step into my destiny. Because the moment that happened, God started moving even faster and even in an even bigger way, and dealt with some old issues as well. So, okay, that is chapter 4. Now, pray about it. Ask God if there is any area in your life where you are not stepping into your destiny because you're scared or because you don't think you can, anything like that. Because each one of us has an Esther 4:14 moment. Each one of us will have a time in our lives where we take a stand. And that is where your destiny lies. Let me know. Okay, love you lots. Bye. See you next week.